I always imagined my first solo house showing would be exciting, a milestone in my real estate career. It was supposed to be a day where I proved myself, a simple task that would go smoothly. It wasn't supposed to end with police officers sweeping the house. But that's exactly what happened. It was spring in Miami, 2019, and I had just started working as a real estate agent. The firm was small, but my boss was good at what she did, and I had spent the last few months shadowing her, learning every trick in the book. I was finally being trusted to handle a showing on my own, and I was determined to make a good impression. The house was a 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom, ranch-style home in a quiet suburban neighborhood. It had been on the market for a while, beautiful property, great layout, but something about it didn't sell. My client, Melissa, was a newly divorced woman in her late 40s, looking to downsize now that her kids had moved out. She seemed excited about the listing, so I wanted to make sure everything was perfect when she arrived. I pulled up to the house 20 minutes early, stepping out into the humid Miami air. The sun was still high, stretching palm tree shadows across the front yard. As I approached the door, a prickling sensation crawled up my neck. The door was already ajar. I stopped. The house was supposed to be vacant. I had double-checked the listing notes that morning. Maybe the last agent forgot to lock up. It happened. Taking a breath, I nudged the door open. The house smelled wrong. Stale air mixed with something faintly damp. It was subtle, but enough to make my stomach twist. I stepped inside and set my bag on the kitchen counter, flipping on the lights. Silence. Everything looked staged. Minimalist furniture, neutral colors, the perfect model home. But something didn't feel right. I walked through the living room, my heels clicking against the hardwood floor. As I moved deeper into the house, I started noticing small details that didn't sit well with me. A kitchen drawer slightly open, a faint imprint on the neatly made bed in the master bedroom, like someone had been sitting there. A hallway closet door that wasn't fully shut. I brushed it off. Maybe a contractor had stopped by for last-minute touch-ups. Maybe the cleaning crew had been and left things slightly askew. Still, my instinct screamed, I wasn't alone. I checked my watch. 15 minutes until Melissa arrived. I took another deep breath, pushing my nerves aside. Then I heard a soft creak from down the hall. I spun toward the sound, my heart hammering. Hello? My voice echoed back at me. Nothing. I laughed at myself, shaking my head. It was an old house, of course, it was going to make noises. To reassure myself, I walked down the hallway, peeking into the guest bedroom and the bathroom. Everything was in its place. The closet doors were closed, the windows were locked. I was freaking myself out for no reason. I returned to the kitchen, straightening the brochures I had laid out on the counter. The moment my fingers touched the paper, my phone buzzed. Melissa had arrived. Relieved to have company, I went to the front door and greeted her with a warm smile, quickly pushing aside my unease. We exchanged pleasantries, and I guided her inside, launching into the usual routine, pointing out the high ceilings, the open floor plan, the recently renovated kitchen. She seemed pleased, nodding along as I spoke. Then she stopped. Her entire expression changed, the blood draining from her face. "What's wrong?" I asked. She didn't say anything, just lifted a shaking hand and pointed down the hallway. I turned. A man stood in the shadows, barefoot, wearing dirty, disheveled clothes. His face was gaunt, hollow-cheeked. His eyes locked onto us with an eerie stillness. Melissa gripped my arm. "We need to leave," she whispered. I agreed. I didn't take my eyes off him as I guided Melissa toward the front door, my fingers shaking as I reached for the knob. Then the man took a step forward. Panic seized my body. I yanked the door open, and we bolted outside, slamming it shut behind us. My hands fumbled for the lock, twisting it until I heard the reassuring click. We ran to Melissa's car, gasping for breath. "Call the police," she said. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. I looked back at the house, my pulse spiking at the possibility of seeing him in the window. But there was nothing. The dispatcher assured us officers were on the way. Minutes stretched endlessly. I kept expecting the man to burst through the door, but he never did. Then, sirens echoing down the empty street. The police moved in swiftly, guns drawn. Melissa and I stood by, watching as they disappeared inside. Then, nothing. A few minutes later, an officer came back out, shaking his head. "There's no one in the house." I felt sick. "No, that's impossible. We saw him." The officer silently communicated with his partner before gesturing us inside. I hesitated but followed. The house was eerily still and empty. No signs of forced entry, no footprints, nothing. But when they checked the hallway closet, they found something, a small pile of clothes, neatly folded in the corner, an empty soda can, a sleeping bag. Someone had been living here. The realization made my skin crawl. He had been there before I arrived. He had been there while I walked through the house, while I set up the brochures, watching, waiting. "Looks like he slipped out the back," the officer said, shining a flashlight toward the now open sliding door. "Probably knew we were coming. The backyard was enclosed, the fence easy enough to climb. He could be anywhere now." Melissa touched my arm. "Let's go." I didn't argue. I thanked the officers and left with Melissa. That night, as I lay in bed, I kept thinking about the fact that if Melissa hadn't pointed him out, I might not have noticed him until it was too late. After that day, I never did another house showing alone, and I never, ever ignore an unlocked door again. House sitting was supposed to be easy. Feeding pets, watering plants, making sure no one broke in. It was easy money, especially for someone like me who didn't mind spending nights alone in big, empty houses. I didn't realize it when I took the job, but this house in Seattle, the one tucked away at the end of a long, winding road, hidden behind tall trees, was about to give me the most terrifying experience of my life. The family was nice, friendly, polite, maybe a little stiff. They walked me through the house, 3 stories, modern floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the woods. It was stunning but eerily quiet, like the kind of place designed for solitude. The lady handed me a typed list of instructions. "The security system arms automatically at midnight," she said, "but you can check the cameras anytime from the app." And she hesitated, looking at her husband. "Please don't answer the door for anyone." I laughed, thinking she was joking. "You expecting trouble?" Her expression didn't change. "Just don't. If someone comes, ignore it. No exceptions." A strange request, but whatever. Their house, their rules. They left for the airport that afternoon, and I settled in. The first night was peaceful. I made myself dinner, played with their 2 cats, and curled up on the couch with a book. The house was quiet, but I liked the silence. At 10:30, I checked the doors, looked at the security cameras. Everything was locked up tight. Nothing but trees and darkness outside. The knock came just after 11 p.m., 3 sharp raps on the front door. I froze, pulse spiking. No one should have been there. The house was isolated, and the family hadn't mentioned any expected visitors. Slowly, I approached the door, standing to the side where I couldn't be seen. Another knock. I checked the security feed. The porch camera showed a man standing at the door. Tall, shoulders hunched, hands stuffed into his jacket. His face was turned away, just enough that I couldn't see his features. Then he spoke. "I'm the owner of this house. I need to get inside." A chill worked its way down my spine. The owner? No. The owners were in London. I had spoken to them just hours ago. I didn't move, didn't respond. The man knocked again, harder this time. I forgot something inside. Just let me in for a minute. I took a step back, my heartbeat frantic. I checked my phone, my fingers shaking, as I texted the owners. "Hey, there's a man here saying he's the owner? Is Mr. Davis supposed to be back?" Time seemed to slow, each minute feeling unbearably long. No response. I looked back at the camera. The man was still there. Standing completely still, his face still turned away from the camera. Then, without another word, he turned and walked off the porch, disappearing past the edge of the camera's view. I didn't sleep that night. By the next morning, I had almost convinced myself it was just a lost neighbor or a confused delivery guy. Mrs. Davis still hadn't responded, which made me uneasy, but maybe she was just busy traveling. The day passed without incident, but the house felt different. I caught myself checking over my shoulder, listening for sounds that weren't there. By 10 p.m., I was on edge, and then, just as I was locking up for the night, I heard a sound from downstairs. Not outside, inside. A soft creak, like a footstep pressing against old wood. I froze. Another creak. Now it was closer. I turned off the lights, heart racing. My phone was in my hand. I checked the security app. All the outdoor cameras showed nothing. Front door, locked. Windows, closed. But then I switched to the indoor feed. The motion-activated camera in the hallway had picked up something. My stomach twisted as I tapped the screen. The footage was dark and grainy, but I saw a shadowy figure moving through the house. He was already inside. I stumbled back, biting down a scream. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely lock the bedroom door. I called 911, whispering into the phone. "Someone is in the house." The dispatcher stayed on the line, trying to keep me calm. But then, a knock at the bedroom door. I nearly dropped the phone. Not pounding, just a slow, soft knock. Tears burned my eyes. I gripped my phone tighter, choking back, the terror rising in my throat. The dispatcher kept talking, but I could barely hear them over the sound of my own pulse hammering in my ears. Then, silence. No footsteps. No movement. The next thing I heard was the police outside. "Seattle PD, open up." I didn't move until I was sure they were inside the house. The police found signs of forced entry in the basement. A window latch had been broken. The worst part, the security footage. When the police reviewed it, they found something I hadn't noticed before. The night before, when the man had knocked on the door, he had never left. After disappearing from the porch, he had walked around the house, found another way in, and he had been inside with me the whole time. I packed my bags that night and left. Mrs. Davis finally texted me back the next morning. "We don't know who that was, but this isn't the first time something like this has happened." I never responded. I just got in my car and drove away. That was my first and last house-sitting job. Now, every night before bed, I check my locks, I check my closets, I check under the bed, because I know better now. Sometimes, the danger isn't outside. It's already in the house. Some jobs make you realize how alone you really are. Working the night shift at a gas station in the middle of nowhere, that was one of them. It was my first day, first night on the job, and I'd been trying to ignore the weird feeling since I clocked in. Maybe it was just nerves. Maybe it was the way the station sat on the edge of town, surrounded by empty road and thick woods. Or maybe it was the fact that my manager, a guy named Ray, had chuckled and said, "You'll get used to the weirdos," before tossing me the keys and heading out. That night, I realized just how vulnerable I was. It was a late July evening, one of those summer Tennessee nights where the air sits heavy on your skin. The gas station was located outside Knoxville, a tiny place with nothing but a single highway stretching in both directions. No houses, no businesses, just a lone gas station glowing in the dark. By 11:30 p.m., I was finishing sweeping the floor, wiping down the counters, and checking the register. We closed at midnight, and I was alone. My coworker Jenna had left an hour ago. That's when a car parked at Pump 4. No one had gotten out. I narrowed my eyes, peering through the window. The car was an older model, a junkyard-worthy car. No lights on, no movement inside. I told myself it wasn't unusual. Maybe the person was talking to someone on the phone. And then, at 11:45 p.m., he walked in. I didn't hear the door chime. I just looked up, and he was there. A tall man, maybe late 40s, wearing a faded baseball cap and a heavy jacket. Odd, considering how hot it was outside. His face was shadowed beneath the brim, and his hands were stuffed deep in his pockets. He didn't go to the coolers or grab a snack. He came straight to the counter and just stood there. I swallowed. "Evening, can I help you?" No answer. His eyes never left mine. After a few seconds, he spoke. His voice was low, rough. "You here alone?" A heavy weight dropped in my stomach. "Nope, my coworker's in the back." "Lie." His mouth twitched, almost like a smile. Then he leaned in slightly. "What time do you get off?" A red flag so bright it nearly blinded me. I reached for the rag next to the register, trying to keep my hands busy. "Midnight," I said. His eyes flicked to the clock on the wall. 11:48 p.m. Not a word. Just a slow nod. Something was wrong. Not just creepy wrong. Unpredictable wrong. The way he stood, too relaxed. I cleared my throat. "Do you, need anything?" His lips twitched again. "You're real pretty." I gripped the counter. I was expecting weird customers. Maybe drunk guys hitting on me, rowdy teenagers messing around. But this was different. This wasn't some harmless weirdo. This man was testing me. I forced a polite smile. "Appreciate it. Now, if you're not buying anything, I need to start closing up." And then, out of nowhere, he spoke. "I am the police." The way he said it, it wasn't a statement. It was a challenge. "Oh, you are?" He nodded slowly. "You got a badge I can see?" His grin widened, but he didn't move. "Don't need to show you nothing." That was it. "Mind if I call dispatch real quick?" I asked, keeping my voice even. Just a routine check-in, procedure. His entire body stiffened. For the first time, he blinked. Then, slowly, he took a step back. "You think I'm lying?" I smiled. "Of course not. Just doing my job." I pressed 9, then 1. His jaw tightened. I saw the veins in his neck flex, and then, as if flipping a switch, he grinned. "Ah, I'm just messing with you. He laughed, a low, breathy sound that made my skin crawl. I kept my finger over the last one. You have a good night now, he said. Then, just as quietly as he came, he turned and walked out. I stayed frozen until I saw his car disappear into the darkness. Then, I locked the doors so fast I nearly jammed the key. I was shaking. My skin felt cold, my stomach twisted in knots. I didn't care if he was joking. Something about that man was wrong. I dialed the last one. When the dispatcher answered, I told her everything. She asked if he was still there. I checked the parking lot and pump 4. No sign of him. I felt like I could breathe again. The real police arrived 10 minutes later. I gave them a description, and they checked the security footage. One of the officers pulled me aside. We've had a few calls about a guy matching that description. My stomach clenched. What kind of calls? Hanging around gas stations, asking about women working alone. My body tensed. They told me they'd patrol the area for the next few nights. And they did. But the man never came back. At least, not while I was there. The scariest part of that night wasn't the man himself. It wasn't his eerie smile or his fake claim to be a cop. It was the way he left. Like he'd only been testing me. Like he was waiting. Like he'd be back when I wasn't ready. After that shift, I quit. And to this day, I don't walk alone at night. Working the night shift at a museum sounds cool in theory. You're surrounded by history, walking the same halls as scholars and curious visitors. But when the crowds are gone, the lights dim, and the silence sets in, museums become something else entirely. At night, they feel too still, like the past is waiting for you to disturb it. I started working at the historic Boston Museum in the fall of 2018. The place wasn't as famous as some of the bigger institutions, but it had a unique atmosphere that made it stand out. Colonial artifacts, wax figures, shadowy hallways full of paintings where the eyes always seemed to follow you. Most of my job was simple: monitor the security cameras, do hourly rounds, and make sure no one had snuck inside after hours. But there was one rule. The elderly caretaker, Mr. Harmon, made sure to emphasize on my first shift. Lock all the doors by midnight. No exceptions. He said it so seriously that I almost laughed. It felt too dramatic for a job that mostly involved checking locks and drinking terrible coffee. But the way he looked at me, the way his wrinkled hands tightened around his key ring, I knew he wasn't joking. I asked him why. He sighed, rubbing his temples like he had explained it 100 times before. The museum closes at 6, but sometimes people linger. Not tourists, not staff, people who shouldn't be here. If you don't lock those doors, you might find someone inside who doesn't belong. I thought he meant homeless people, maybe teenagers sneaking in for a thrill. Either way, I wasn't worried. I'd worked security before. If someone was inside, I'd deal with it. I should have listened to him. I locked every door, double-checked every exhibit, and stayed glued to the security monitors. But after a few shifts, I got comfortable. The museum was always empty. So the following Friday, when I saw the time creeping toward midnight, I stalled for a moment before locking the last door. I was alone. What was the harm in waiting? Maybe it was boredom. Maybe it was the urge to prove Mr. Harmon wrong. But for the first time, I let one door remain unlocked, just to see if anything would happen. At first, nothing did. Then, around 1:07 a.m., the motion detector in the East Wing went off. I sat up, staring at the monitor. The East Wing housed the museum's oldest exhibits: antique furniture, Revolutionary War weapons, and a large display of wax figures dressed in 18th century clothing. The screen flickered. For a second, I thought I saw movement near the wax figures. Someone was there. I grabbed my flashlight and left the security office. The East Wing was at the far end of the museum. As I walked down the long corridors, the silence pressed against me. My footsteps echoed, bouncing off the marble floors. When I reached the exhibit, I slowed down. The wax figures stood in their usual positions. 3 men and 1 woman frozen in time, dressed in powdered wigs and old-fashioned coats. But one of them looked different. I moved my flashlight over the display. The plaque beneath the figures listed their names, representations of real historical figures. I counted 1, 2, 3, 4, but there were 5 people standing there. A 5th figure positioned slightly behind the others. I frowned. The museum didn't have 5 wax figures in this display. I took a step closer. Then, as I adjusted my flashlight, he moved. The breath hitched in my throat. My body locked up. I swung the flashlight directly at him, heart hammering. The figure was gone. I swept the beam across the room. The wax figures stood where they always had, untouched, their painted eyes staring blankly ahead. But the 5th figure, the man I swore I had just seen, had vanished. I did a full sweep of the wing, checked behind the display cases, listened for footsteps. Nothing. But I knew what I saw. And the longer I stood there, the more wrong the room felt. Like I had walked into something I wasn't supposed to see. I locked the door and went back to the security office. I replayed the security footage 5 times before I called Mr. Harmon. The video showed the wax figures standing still. Then at 1:07 a.m., something shifted in the shadows. A shape stepped forward just slightly enough for the motion detector to go off. And then it disappeared. Not walked away, not ran out of frame, just disappeared. My hands felt clammy as I gripped the phone. Mr. Harmon answered on the first ring. "You saw him, didn't you?" His voice was quiet. I swallowed hard. "Who?" There was a pause. Then he sighed. "Call the police. Tell them to check the walls." The police arrived just before sunrise. They didn't believe me at first. Even after I showed them the security footage, they chalked it up to a glitch. But when they searched the East Wing, they found something else. A hidden access panel, a section of the wall that slid open. Inside, they found an old sleeping bag, empty food wrappers, and a pile of clothes. Someone had been living inside the museum walls. The officers did a full sweep of the building, but the man, whoever he was gone. The only trace of him was a single dark coat neatly folded and left behind. The museum tightened security after that night. New locks, new cameras. Mr. Harmon refused to talk about it. I quit 2 weeks later. I never got answers. Who was he? How long had he been there? But there's one thing I can't shake. That night on the security footage when the motion detector went off, the figure wasn't just moving. He was watching me, staring at the camera. And if I hadn't locked that last door, I think he would have still been inside. If these stories made you double-check your locks before bed, hit that like button and share with someone who needs a reminder to trust their gut. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another terrifying tale. Ever had a creepy first day on the job? Drop your story in the comments and email me. We want to hear all the chilling details. Stay safe out there, and remember, sometimes the scariest part of a new job isn't the workload. It's who or what might be watching. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next nightmare.